Some of our most creative and innovative people and movements are like those edge landscapes in nature, where several different ecosystems meet, like, for example, estuaries that mingle salt and freshwater plants and animals. Those liminal ecozones are often the most productive, diverse, and resilient places in the natural world. It's the same in the human social realm. The spaces where different cultures, disciplines, traditions, ideas, and people interact are often the most fertile ground for new visions and directions. Well, few people exemplify that as greatly as our next speaker, who offers us a nearly perfect archetypal expression of what has become known in activist circles and movement parlance as intersectionality. She's also a brilliant systems thinker and strategist who is leading the transformation of an entire industry. Saru Jayarman is usually portrayed as a visionary labor leader and defender of immigrant rights. And she is all that, but she's also a scholar, a researcher, a teacher, and a brilliant thinker and writer on ethics, justice, and morality. Her 2013 book expanded her purview, as Behind the Kitchen Door offers a profound exploration of the political, economic, and moral implications of dining out. Things most of us hadn't thought about. In 2016, she published Forked, an illuminating expose of the working conditions of service industry employees throughout the nation. Saru rose to public prominence after 9/11, when some of the immigrant workers in the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center in New York lost their lives, while the remainder lost their jobs, and the survivors became motivated to fight for better working conditions for their profession. Saru became a major leader and organizer in these efforts as the co-founder and co-director of the Restaurant Opportunities Centers, or ROC United, a truly groundbreaking undertaking that seeks nothing less than to transform the entire restaurant industry. They have successfully mobilized 25,000 restaurant workers to organize nationally, along with hundreds of restaurant owners and several thousand consumer members, to win workplace justice campaigns, improve wages, conduct research and policy work, partner with responsible restaurants, and launch their own cooperatively owned restaurants. To more effectively transform the industry while raising public awareness of and busting the myths that had kept unjust work practices a norm, ROC has also published 45 reports and 3 books. That story of Saru and her co-founders' work starting ROC has been chronicled in a book, The Accidental American by Rinku Sen, which I commend to you as an eye-opening and truly great read. Besides this brilliant labor organizing, Saru, who is a graduate of Yale Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, is also the director of the Food Labor Research Center at UC Berkeley and a lecturer at the Goldman School as part of the Berkeley Food Institute. She has deeply studied working life in general and immigrants' working lives in particular, and has produced some of the best research and analysis in this field, co-editing the influential collection, The New Urban Immigrant Workforce. Saru has been named one of Crain's 40 Under 40, CNN's 10 Visionary Women, and was a 2014 White House Champion of Change. So please join me in welcoming a brilliant activist who, on top of all that, is also a stunning living illustration of just how invaluable the contributions and leadership of immigrants have always been and continue to be to the vitality of American society. A leader who fills me with hope and inspires me deeply while expanding my vision of what's possible. Saru Jayarman.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thank you so much to the Bioneers crew for having me, and I'm going to actually say a little bit more about Bioneers and my experience with it later in the conversation. But I wanted to tell you a little bit first about who I am and this issue we've been working on for the last over a decade now, really trying to change the lives of people in the largest and fastest growing industry in America. So as you heard, I kind of started this journey after 9/11. On September 11th, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center. Many of you may have known it. Maybe you ate there, called Windows on the World. It was on the 107th floor at the top of Tower 1. And over 300 workers worked there, and 73 died that morning on 9/11. They either jumped to their deaths or they were literally incinerated inside the restaurant because the plane hit below them and the heat rose so quickly that they were evaporated very quickly. After the tragedy, I was asked to come together with workers from Windows on the World. My co-founder actually was a head waiter, an immigrant from Morocco, and he and I started the organization. We called it ROC, right after the tragedy, Restaurant Opportunity Center. And what started as a little relief center after the tragedy has grown now over the last almost 16 years into a national organization. We now have 25,000 worker members, about 700 employers, restaurant owners who are working with us, ranging from really high-profile chefs and restaurateurs like Danny Meyer and Tom Colicchio, star of Top Chef, all the way down to small mom-and-pop restaurants around the country that really believe in actually better wages and working conditions for workers in this industry, along with tens of thousands of consumer members, people like everybody in this room who eat out and believe actually we need a different way of eating out. And the reason we've grown so fast over the last 16 years really is the explosion in this industry. The restaurant industry right now is the second largest and absolute fastest growing sector of the US economy. It's actually over 12 million workers. 1 in 11 American workers currently works in this industry right now. 1 in 2 of us in this room has worked in the industry, and in the United States has worked in this industry at some point in their lifetimes. Can you just raise your hand if you ever worked in the restaurant industry? Can you look around the room? Can you just look around the room? This is America. It doesn't matter if I'm talking to the US Senate, or I'm talking to academics, or who I'm talking to. Every time I ask the question, the room looks like this. So many of us have worked in this industry. Every one of us eats out, and in fact, as Americans, we are eating out in ridiculously ever-increasing numbers. We just made world history last year, becoming the first nation on earth in which we now spend more money on eating out than we do on food eaten inside the home. So the industry just continues to explode. There's no sign of it being replaced by technology anytime soon. Robots are not taking over these jobs. And it's just not going anywhere. And yet, despite its growth, despite its size, despite the fact we've all worked in it, despite the fact that we all touch it every day, despite all of that, it continues to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States. So every year, the Department of Labor puts out a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs, and every year, 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs are restaurant jobs. Actually, just this one industry employs the 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in America. And, you know, the craziness of it is actually, we've heard a lot from the amazing fast food workers who've been standing up so courageously, but only 1 of the 7 lowest paying jobs in America that's a restaurant job is a fast food occupation. 6 of the 7 are full service restaurant jobs, waiters, bartenders, cooks, people who you may not think maybe if you live in the Bay Area or New York or DC, you may not think these workers are the lowest paid workers in America, but across America, these are the poorest workers in America, not the least skilled. These are highly skilled professionals. But the fact that we've got the largest and fastest growing industry in America proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs has tremendous implications for all of us, regardless of what issue you work on or what you care about or where you work, because you have to think about it. What does it mean to have the largest and fastest growing industry in America proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs? It means that we are single-handedly, as an industry, growing the low-wage floor of the economy. It means that right now, 1 in 3 working Americans works full-time or more than full-time and lives in poverty. 1 in 3. By 2020, some say 2025, that number will be 1 in 2. Half of all working Americans working full-time or more than full-time and living in poverty. What does that mean for our ability to survive as a nation, to have a GDP, to consume? If half the nation can't afford to consume, what does it even mean for our own industry when half of America can't afford to eat out? What does it mean on any of the issues you care about? Will they be able to buy food, let alone sustainable food? Will they be able to consume any of the products that you appreciate and choose because they're organic or sustainable over others? Who's going to consume those products when half of America can't afford to consume, period? And what does it mean for the survival of a country if half of the country is the have-nots? What does that mean for our survival as a nation? It means we're headed to disaster very, very quickly. And that growth from 1 in 3 to 1 in 2, half of the country, is due almost entirely to the growth of this one industry, the restaurant industry. And so you ask yourself, how is it that you've got the largest and fastest growing industry in America with some of the largest and frankly most profitable chains in America? How is it that they continue to be the absolute lowest paying employer when they are growing so fast? Well, all of our research points to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It is led by the Fortune 500 chains. Actually, the 4 leaders are McDonald's, Darden, which is the largest full-service restaurant company in the world. It owns Olive Garden and Capital Grill and so many other restaurants. Yum Brands, Taco Bell, KFC, Pizza Hut, and Disney, which is one of the leaders of this trade lobby and actually a horrible employer. All of the chains belong to this association, lead this association, and turns out in doing research, I found out a couple years ago that I had always thought this association had only been around 20 or 30 or 50 years. No, turns out they've been around 150 years since the emancipation of the slaves. Because it turns out that tipping as a practice did not originate in the United States. It originated in feudal Europe. So if you ever read, Jane Austen, or I'm a bit of a nerd, I read a lot of William Thackeray or Old English literature, or you watch Downton Abbey, or you ever see period pieces, you will see occasional references to tipping. It was noblesse oblige, something that an aristocrat gave to a subservient, something on top of a wage, by the way, because serfs and vassals in feudal Europe actually received wages. And tips were gratuities on top, noblesse oblige. Well, this idea came to the States in the 1850s and 1860s, and when it came, there was massive populist rejection of the idea as undemocratic, un-American, a vestige of the feudal system. And that movement, which was so successful and spread to Europe and actually succeeded in getting rid of tipping in a lot of Europe, here in the United States was squashed by the Restaurant Association, the early industry lobby, that found that tipping was a beautiful way to hire newly freed slaves and continue the legacy of slavery by not paying them anything at all and let them live on customer tips. So at the turn of the century, 19th century, the majority of tipped workers in the country were black, were former slaves. They were actually given a $0 wage, and that was codified into the very first minimum wage law that passed in 1938 as part of the New Deal, which said that tipped workers would get a $0 wage from their employer as long as tips brought them to the full minimum wage. And we went from $0 in 1938 to a whopping $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States in 2017. And it ranges between $2 and $7 in 43 states in the United States. California is only one of 7 states that has gotten rid of this legacy of slavery. But 43 states persist in asking employers to pay $2 and $3 and $4 an hour. New Mexico is $2.13. Colorado is $4 something. Pennsylvania is $2.85. D.C. is $2.77 an hour. Massachusetts is $3 an hour. It is a shame. It is a shame in the United States that anybody is being paid $2 and $3 an hour. But it is even more so a shame that as voters and citizens, we have allowed ourselves and our elected officials to be bamboozled by a restaurant association that says, it's okay these workers are paid $2 and $3 an hour. They're white guys working in fancy fine dining steakhouses. They make $80,000 or $100,000 a year, $30 an hour. They're rolling in money. They make so much money in tips. So much money in tips, when in fact, 70% of tipped workers in America are, guess who? They are women. They are women who work at IHOP and Applebee's and Denny's. They are women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce and use food stamps at double the rate because they don't make hardly anything in tips. They're women whose median wage is about $9 an hour, including tips. They use food stamps at double the rate, which, if you think about it, means millions of women in the fastest growing employer of women in the United States feed us and can't afford to feed their families. But worst of all, these are women who must tolerate the absolute worst sexual harassment of any industry in the United States, because when you are a woman who earns $2 and $3 and $4 an hour, if any of you have ever lived off the tip minimum wage, you know your wage is so small it goes entirely to taxes. You get a paycheck that says this is not a pay stub because your wage has gone entirely to taxes. You are living off your tips. You are living off customer whims and fancies. You are having to tolerate the likes of Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein coming into your restaurant and feeling like they can do whatever they want to you because they pay your money, your income in tips. You feed your family in tips. 40% of these women are single moms. So it's amazing. I feel so amazed and in awe of the women that have come out to share stories in the last few weeks. And I know from this work that I've done for the last 15 years that for every one of those stories, there are thousands more women in this industry, this one industry, who live this life every day of their lives, putting up with the Harvey Weinsteins and the Donald Trumps, because they know that's the way to earn their income, because they don't actually get a wage from their boss. They have to get it from whatever the customer will leave for them. And besides the millions of women for whom this is daily life, who take great pride, by the way, in their work, who take great pride in being great hospitality workers. Not everybody can do it. Take great pride in their work, but must tolerate the most insane sexual harassment and assault to feed their families and tips. Besides those millions of women, there are millions more young women, our daughters, my little girls, your daughters, or you, for whom this has been the first job in high school, college, or graduate school. This is how we are introduced to the world of work. This is how we are taught what is acceptable and tolerable in the workplace. We are taught that your worth depends on how much money you can earn from selling yourself, showing more cleavage, wearing tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. So for everybody here who asked yourselves, how could women have voted for Donald Trump, I will tell you, when half of America starts their career as women in this industry and is told your worth is dependent on your willingness and your ability to get a good tip from a man like Donald Trump, you don't see him as a predator, you see him as a good tipper. Every time I speak to an audience like this, a woman comes up to me and says, I'm now a union organizer, a corporate lawyer, an IBM executive. I've been sexually harassed later in my career or even recently, and I didn't do anything about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants. So, given all of this, and given research that we did on these 7 states, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, that got rid of this system decades ago, we found that those 7 states, by the way, are faring better on every measure than the 43 states with lower wages for tipped workers, higher restaurant sales per capita, higher job growth in the restaurant industry, higher rates of tipping. People actually tip better in these states. And even half the rate of sexual harassment as the rest of the country. So in all of this talk about solutions for what we are seeing as an epidemic of male-powered and disgusting behavior, I have a solution. Pay most of the women in America an actual wage. Pay them a wage. How hard is that? How hard is that? If this is the largest employer of women, then force this industry to pay them an actual wage. So we launched this campaign in 2013 called One Fair Wage, calling for every state to copy the 7 states that have already done this with great success. And we managed to actually move a lot of people over the last couple of years in our direction, including a lot of the industry leaders. I mentioned Danny Meyer, Tom Colicchio, who said, "You're right, this system is wrong," and have moved away from it, actually, which has been great. We managed to get Maine to pass a ballot measure to become the 8th state in the union to join all the other states that got rid of this lower wage for tipped workers. They were at $3 an hour. But right after they passed it, it was the most popular ballot measure in the history of the state. Right after they passed it, the National Restaurant Association swooped into Maine, convinced a small subset of workers that their tips would now go down if their wages went up, and then used them to convince the legislature, Democratic legislature, to overturn the most popular ballot measure in the history of the state. So we are up against the most powerful industry lobby you can possibly imagine. We have calculated about $10 million trying to shut us down and shut me up in particular. They have followed me around the country. They've set up attack websites with my children's pictures on it. They have done 2 congressional investigations into us and at least 20 lawsuits. They have gone after our funders and to their homes and hacked into their databases to try to get them to stop funding us. They have gone to the IRS to try to get them to revoke our tax-exempt status. And now they've done something really extraordinary. They got together with President Trump and have announced new proposed regulation that would allow restaurant owners, if they pay the full minimum wage of $7.25, to keep their workers' tips. Which means that President Trump, the restaurant owner, whenever he leaves office tomorrow, or maybe sooner, or maybe in 2 years, whenever he leaves office, he will go back to being able to run restaurants and totally keep all his workers' tips. This has already been made law in the 10th Circuit, which is like Colorado, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and now Trump's Department of Labor, getting together with the other NRAs, proposing to make it federal law, which in my opinion is an extraordinary moment of opportunity. Because if we can use this to galvanize millions of workers who would be outraged that their tips are taken away, and hopefully millions of consumers who should be outraged, this is consumer fraud. Your tip, you are paying what you think is a tip to workers, and it will actually go to the boss. We need to mobilize lots of people around this, first to stop this law, which we actually have a chance of stopping, and then to say, you know what we actually need is for you to actually pay your workers an actual wage, one fair wage, so that we as customers aren't subsidizing multi-billion-dollar corporations, first by paying their workers' wages through our tips, and second by paying for their workers' survival, really, through taxpayer-funded public assistance. We spend $16.5 billion annually on taxpayer-funded public assistance. I'm talking about food stamps and Medicaid. For the poorest workforce in America, every Olive Garden costs us $250,000 annually in public assistance. So we have a chance to do something, to get outraged. On Monday, we are launching a campaign. You'll be able to text TIP on Monday, TIP, to 225568 and get a link where you can send a letter to Secretary of Labor Acosta telling him to stop this absurd, outrageous rule. And then we'll be able to mobilize for even more. We are moving one fair wage legislation and ballot measures in Michigan, in New York, and DC. But it will take so much. It will take so much. It will take all of us coming together to come up against the power of the National Restaurant Association. And this is where I want to talk about Bioneers. Because I was here last year. The folks at Bioneers were, I thought, forward-thinking enough to ask me to pull together a panel on the Fight for 15. So I brought some leaders together from the Fight for 15, and about 7 people showed up to the workshop. And so I wrote Bioneers and said, you know, what can we do to make people think this is important, relevant to all the other issues we're facing right now at Bioneers, whether it's climate change, climate catastrophe, the earth coming to a close, fire, hurricane, what can we do to say that this is important? And they invited me to speak here, and I'm really so grateful for that. But it did make me think, why should you care? Why should anybody care? Why should you care? Maybe some of us are right that really first we have to save the earth before we think of anything else. First we have to make sure that humans can survive on this planet before we think of anything else. Maybe first we put everything else aside and focus all of our energy on stopping climate change, stopping climate catastrophe, because it's moving so fast and we don't have much time. And of course, even I, who has children, and I hope to have grandchildren, I can see that. And yet, I think that there's a real problem if we aren't simultaneously thinking about saving the earth and our ability to survive, and also thinking about, well, if we survive through climate catastrophe, if we save the earth as a place for people to live, what kind of what kind of life do we want for the people who make it? Do we want to make it past this period of disaster into a world of haves and have-nots? I don't know how many of you caught the Washington Post article that came out last weekend, maybe some of you did, about the fact that dramatically increased numbers of seniors are having to work until death now in minimum wage jobs. And there's a whole new group of them that are actually in RVs, traveling the country from minimum wage to minimum wage job, seasonal migrants. I'm not talking about brown people like me. I'm actually talking about older white people for the most part. And it described, this scene in Maine where people during the summer, older people, elderly people, go work as waiters and waitresses on cruise ships in Bar Harbor in Maine, serving much wealthier older people, their same age, who are enjoying themselves in the leisures of Maine. And everything about it, from the migratory nature to the haves and have-nots, just so resemble. It was like you were reading an article in the 30s during the Depression or during the Gilded Age. But you have to understand, we have surpassed the income inequality of the Gilded Age. We are in the greatest income inequality in the history of this country. And so even if we survive as a human race through climate catastrophe, if half of us can't actually live, survive, eat, consume, what kind of a society will we be living in at that point? So here's some reasons why I think we should care, why we should prioritize this alongside saving the earth for human survival. Here's some reasons. Maybe you already know this. Maybe I'm speaking to a convinced audience, but it does make me think. Why should we care? First of all, it is these low-wage workers who are the frontline survivors of and disaster recipients, right, of climate catastrophe. So they are the ones bearing the brunt. Second of all, if we want to build any kind of political power going into the future to stop climate change, to stop corporations from doing what they are doing, if half the country is suffering with just making it from day to day, if we don't think about addressing their needs, at least listening to them and working with them, we're not going to have the political power to stop the corporations from doing what they are doing. And that's the third reason. These are the same corporations that are killing the earth, that are killing the environment, that are also killing workers. So we have common targets. But ultimately, again, we can't survive. There will be no organic products or sustainable products of any kind if people can't consume. And fundamentally, these people are not just consumers, they are humans, and so are you. And we are all human beings. And I know fundamentally you care not just about the earth, but about equity. And fundamentally, you want us not just to survive through climate catastrophe, but thrive, live. Ultimately, it is this question, and then I will wrap up. It is this question. Ultimately, who gets to decide whether we continue this legacy of slavery? Who gets to decide whether, 200 years ago we said no to an industry who said we will never be able to survive if we have to pay our own workers' wages. And here we are facing another industry 200 years later. We said no at that time because slavery was inhumane. why are we saying okay now? So who gets to decide whether we say okay to slavery now? Who gets to decide how a woman is treated in the workplace? Is it a trade lobby? Is it corporations? Is it the other NRA? Or is it we, the people? Thank you.